Are you one of those people who loves taking shortcuts? Right? One of my brothers used to cut corners all the time. Wanted to save time, wanted to save energy, save money. He would do whatever it took to save and cut corners. So one day we're over at my grandparents' house and I caught him with his pants down. Literally. I walked in on him in the bathroom and he is trying to zip up his pants and he just couldn't get the job done. And the reason was he had his pajamas on underneath. And I was like, Aaron, what on earth are you doing? He's like, it was going to take too long to take off my pajamas in the morning and then put them back on at night. So I just figured I'd leave them on underneath my pants all day long. I was like, dude, what a great idea. Yes. No, I was like, what are you thinking, man? That's crazy. That's gross. That's gross. You slept in those. That's disgusting. You know, some of you guys like to cut corners by taking showers at night, right? You know who you are. That's disgusting. You sleep all night long in your sweat and in your dead skin cells. You're rolling around in bed in these things, and you wake up in the morning and they are caked on your body. And then you put on your clothes and you've sealed them in for the day. Guys, it needs to stop. Tonight is an intervention for you. There are a lot of funny ways that we like to cut corners, right? We can think of all kinds of different examples, and some of them are kind of goofy, and others aren't. You know, when it comes to work, man, I don't know about you, but work is something that I like to avoid as much as I can. And I try to cut corners when I can. I try to, think of how can I do this faster so I could get it done and go do this or that or the other thing. And it irritates me when I have a lot of work to do. And what irritates me even more is when somebody over me, an authority over me, gives me more work to do. And I'm like, argh. I remember being in school, and I'd have these teachers. This is in seminary, right? You were all supposed to be, super spiritual and super holy. And the teachers, would announce to us, a surprise assignment, or, you have to write a paper, or there's a test coming up tomorrow. Just be like, who do you think you are? You jerk. Come on. You're giving me more work. And I remember being so frustrated at these people who were giving me more and more work to do. In Ephesians chapter 6, we deal with work a little bit. But we deal with it in the form of slavery. Okay, check it out. Ephesians chapter 6, we're going to go 5 to 8 tonight. Now, Paul has already talked about what knowing God is supposed to do for husbands and wives, how that's supposed to affect their relationship. And then he talked about, okay, we did husbands and wives, now let's talk about children and their parents. What does that look like? If you're a Christian, how are you supposed to act towards your parents? Parents, how are you supposed to act towards your children? And now he says, slaves, look at this, verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord, not to man. Here's the last verse. Knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he's a slave or free. I think it's funny because we read Ephesians, and if you look at it, Paul just goes in, he does husbands, wives, children's parents, and then he goes right into slaves and masters, as if we know what that's like. Well, it was a reality for him, right? Maybe not so much for us. So maybe what we need to do real quickly is refresh ourselves on what this whole slavery stuff was like back then. Some experts say this. They say that 1/3 of the population of big cities like Ephesus, they say 1/3 of that population was slaves. That's a whole lot of slaves, right? That is a lot of people who were in slavery in that city. They say that slavery was actually an essential part of society. Society was built on it. If you took the slavery out of that society, it just would kind of crumble. It was not only that, but it was an essential part of the family unit. like if you were growing up and you didn't have slaves, something was wrong with you, right? Normal families had slaves. And slaves were considered part of the family, but they were also considered possessions. Kind of like a tool, right? You use them. They're like an appliance, like your dishwasher, or your microwave, or like your lawnmower. You owned a slave, and your slave would do some of those tasks. And they really, in some cases, weren't viewed as much better than that. You know, some of you guys like to slam that microwave door, and it bothers your parents, and they're just like, no, don't slam it, you're going to break that thing. And that's how people treated slaves. Slaves didn't have the same rights as citizens, and often they were abused and neglected and exploited. Get this, here's a description, here's a quote of what slavery was like. The Roman statesman Cato, he said this: "Old slaves should be thrown on a dump." Why are you laughing? "And when a slave is ill, don't feed him anything. It's not worth your money." Ouch. "Take 6 slaves and throw them away because they're nothing but inefficient tools." Brutal, right? That's brutal. Augustus crucified a slave who accidentally killed his pet quail. Can you imagine? What a way to go. You were a slave, you somehow killed this pet quail, and now you're done. It's brutal. It says this: "A man named Polio threw a slave into a pond," and you guys are like, oh, well, what's the big deal about that? "A pond of deadly lamprey eels for breaking a crystal goblet." That's like James Bond style. Like you throw them into like the piranha pool. Another guy wrote of a slave owner whose greatest pleasure was listening, this is the quote, "listening to the sweet song of his slaves being flogged." Don't you wish you were a slave back in that day? It was brutal. It was brutal. And yet it was a part of the culture. It was part of the legal system. The government supported it. This is the way things were. Now, when we look at what Paul's writing right here, he doesn't say, "Go slavery! I love it! Got 10 slaves of my own." He doesn't say that. He doesn't condone slavery. He doesn't say, hey, this is the way to go. We should keep doing it. But what he does say is, you're a slave, and now you're a Christian. How does that work? Remember a week or two ago, we said that when you trust in Jesus, it doesn't remove the authorities that are over you. So many of us, we want to get out from that authority. We want to take them and get rid of them. And we think that if only I could get rid of this authority, if only I could get rid of that authority, then my life would be so much better. And some people, I think, when they become Christians, they think that God's just going to magically maneuver things so that their life is so much easier and so much better. But the reality is God doesn't do that. He doesn't remove the authorities automatically because you believe in him. But he does give you the ability to live under them in such a way that brings him glory. And that's exactly what Paul is talking about tonight. So, what does that mean for us? That's what we want to talk about tonight. So we know a little bit about what slavery was like back then. How do we bridge the gap and learn anything from it? We can definitely learn something from it. Why? Because maybe you don't have the title slave, but all of us have authorities over us. All of you have, teachers. All of you have youth leaders. All of you guys have bosses. All of you guys have parents. Some of you guys have a pastor over you. They're your authorities, and you've got to listen to them. And so this, in a way, the relationship is similar to what's going on here. Now, I'm going to try not to throw you into the pool of eels, right? And I'm going to try not to enjoy the sound of you being punished and flogged. I may not be that evil, and maybe your teachers aren't that evil, but sometimes it does feel like that, doesn't it? and you're in a situation where it's just like, man, this person exists to abuse me. Have you ever felt like that? Man, I have. So many times. So many times. And because of that, because of those situations we find ourselves in, what Paul has to say in this passage is super relevant to where we're at. It's not always easy for us to obey these people. And sometimes we think that it would be a lot better if we could just get rid of them. Some of you guys experienced senioritis recently, right? You know what that is? It's this condition that affects people in their last year of high school or their last year of college. And I had senioritis, I think, all through college and all through seminary. And I just hated that idea of doing anything for these teachers. And I remember thinking, like, how dare they? How dare they critique me on my work? Who are these people? And I'm not a guy who normally likes authority over me. And I think that all of us kind of have a little bit of that inside. Paul says, if you're a person that now trusts in Jesus and you're being transformed by him, then you need to treat your teachers, you need to treat your bosses, you need to treat your leaders, you need to treat them differently than you would before. Before, you may have done something like this. Maybe you did something to kind of undermine their authority. Maybe you try to get away with as much as possible at your work. And so when your boss isn't looking or your teacher isn't looking, you can let things slide a little bit. You can relax a little bit. Or maybe when, your teacher, you think they can't hear you, you turn away from them, you just say something under your breath, right? That is disrespectful. Or maybe you roll their eyes when they're not, your eyes when they're not looking. Or you talk bad about them behind their back. This message is for you. Paul says that knowing God should change a few things. Here they are. Number one, knowing God should change your actions. It should change your actions. Look at verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters. Obey your earthly masters. I wish I could tell you that I looked at the Greek and the word obey actually means something different than to literally obey. But the reality is, it means obey. It means obey. And it doesn't say obey when they're nice to you. Obey when you feel like it. Obey when it's a command that falls in line with your heart's desires. No, it doesn't say that. It says obey, and it means obey in everything, all of the time. And you might be thinking, man, that stinks. I don't want to hear that. I know, me either. I don't want to hear it. But it's still there. And Paul's saying, if you're a Christian, this is what it is. Those of you who know God should obey those in authority over you, period. Now, there may be a little exception here, right? There's one way where you maybe don't have to obey, and that's this. If they tell you to do something that's against what you know is God's will. In other words, they tell you to do something that is sinful. And at that point, you would have to say, like some of Jesus' followers, I have to obey God rather than men. And that's totally valid. And Paul would say, yeah, go for it. But in all other circumstances, you got to obey. Now, before you write Paul off and before you write this message off, hang in there. There's a couple more things that we need to talk about that will help you understand and come to grips just a little bit better with this idea of obeying. I know right now, like, gut reaction is like, no, I don't want to. That doesn't feel good, but hang in there. Knowing God should change your actions. It should also change your attitude. He says, slaves, obey your earthly masters. And he says, with fear and trembling. Like, whoa. I need to be afraid of my boss now? I need to be afraid of my teachers? The New Living Translation translates it this way. Obey them with deep respect and fear. man, we can't get rid of that word fear. What's up with that word fear? It's not the kind of fear you have, when you watch a scary movie. I mean, every time you see your boss or teacher, you're not supposed to go, ah, ah, ah! You're not supposed to do that, right? Don't do that. They'll freak out at you, right? You don't need to do that. But what he's talking about here is the kind of fear that you're supposed to have for God, right? It's this huge respect. It's this acknowledgement of the significance of the position or the person, right? It's kind of like handling dynamite. You guys do this all the time, right? You got dynamite at home and you juggle it, and you stick it down your mouth like this, and you're just like, feeding it to your dog, and it's like if you had no fear of dynamite, no respect for it, you just toss it around, you juggle, you do all kinds of different things, right? But you don't do that because you know what dynamite is. And if you've watched some different TV shows and some different movies, you also know that dynamite is extremely unstable. And if you get a dynamite that's really old and it's kind of sweat and some of the is it nitroglycerin, nitro or whatever, it kind of seeps out. It's really, really unstable, and if you move it the wrong way or if you drop it, you're gone. It's poof, and you're like, yeah, whee, going to heaven, right? And so when it comes to dynamite, you pick it up and you're gentle with it, and you're careful. You have a fear of it. And I think it's the same way we should regard our authorities, that these people, not that they're going to kill us, but there's this respect for the gravity, the weight of the position, the significance of it, right? Notice he also says this. He says to obey with a sincere heart. So you obey with fear and trembling, with this deep respect, but you obey with a sincere heart. In other words, he says, don't be two-faced about it. Don't be one of those guys who says, yes, sir, whatever you say, sir, and then you turn right around and you're grumbling and you're complaining and you're like, yeah, that big fat jerk. But, then he turns around and he's like, excuse me, what did you say? And you're like, nothing. Don't be that people. He said, that kind of person. Be a person with integrity. Be the same on the inside as you are on the outside. Have you ever gotten a piece of Halloween candy or Easter candy, and you get the package, right? And it's like bright and shiny, it looks great, and then you open it up and you're just like, this is disgusting. The chocolate is all white and it's crumbled. And you're just like, what happened to this thing? I remember I was in Awana years ago, and at the end of the evening, we'd get prizes. I think it was Pioneers or something like that. We get prizes, and they have this little treasure chest, and you all come up, and they'd open up the treasure chest, and they had all this candy in there. When we'd be grabbing at the candy and stuff like that, and we're opening the candy, and it was like a Butterfinger or something like that. We open it up, and it was that pasty white, right? And it was crumbling, but it was moving. There were maggots inside this candy, and you're just like, no! And you had all these little screaming Pioneer boys, no, no! They're like, is this the girls' group? No, it's the boys. They saw a worm. Don't be different on the inside than you are on the out. Be a person of integrity. Be the same on the outside. Be a sincere person. In other words, you're at work or you're at school and you're saying one thing to your teacher, saying, yes, I'll do this, or no, or whatever, but you're the same. You don't walk away and grumble and complain and get all upset and talk to your friends about what a jerk that teacher is. He says, be a person of sincere heart. He says this, verse 6, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, right? Have you ever been in a class where the teacher has to step out for a few minutes? Or maybe you had a substitute teacher, right? You know what those days are like. And it doesn't take long for everything to spin out of control. And you've got the one student who goes up to the whiteboard and is drawing the goofy pictures of the teacher or doing hangman. And then you've got the couple making out in the corner. And then you've got the paper airplanes that are flying all over the place. And everyone's like, yeah, party! They're loving life. He says, don't be someone who just gives eye service. Do you know what eye service is? It's acting one way when they're looking at you. I remember I worked at an animal hospital for a couple years in high school, and I had the worst job. I mean, I got to do some cool things like assistant surgeries and stuff like that, but man, the other jobs I had to do were disgusting. And I won't even go into it right now, but yeah, you do like a really dirty job, and there was this back room, I remember, and sometimes the doctor would be up in his office, and I'd be so tempted. We had stacks and stacks of newspapers. You'd just be so bored and so tempted to just like grab a newspaper. This is how bad it was. You start reading the newspaper back there. And the doctor's not looking. I'm so bored. I got time to kill. I'm reading. That was before I had a cell phone. No cell phones back there. I mean, I was that desperate. That's eye service. When they're not looking, you're like, I can get away with it. Was I still getting paid? You better believe it. I'm still making money. Still making my like $6.25, right? And yet I was totally ripping that animal hospital off because I wasn't doing what I was supposed to be doing. He says, don't be one of those people. Don't be a people pleaser, someone who just gives eye service. Why? Why obey? And why have the right attitude? Last thing, knowing God should change your perspective. You should change your perspective. Check out this passage again. He says this. He says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, underline this, as you would Christ. He goes on, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord. Do you get the perspective he's giving you? He's saying, because you know God and you know what God is doing and has done inside of you, the way that you work should be completely different. There's a difference here. Something has changed inside of you. The perspective is that I obey these masters, I obey my teachers, I obey my authorities, I obey my bosses, I obey my parents. I do it not because they deserve it, not because they're nice to me. They could be cruel to me, and yet I should still obey them and have a totally right attitude, sincere heart, because I'm really doing it for God. Back in the 1600s, there was a man who had served in the French army. And he served in the French army, and he was actually wounded in battle, severely wounded in battle, actually served time as a prisoner of war. When he did finally heal up, he was disabled, and he came to know Jesus at the age of 18. And he lived for a while, and then later on in life, he decided, you know what, I really care about my relationship with Christ. I really want to use what's left of my life to serve and honor and glorify Him. So you know what he did? Back in the 1600s, if you were serious about following Christ, you did what a lot of guys did, and they joined a monastery. He became a monk, and he thought, man, I'm going to devote my life completely, totally, 100% to God and His service. And I'm going to do great things as a monk. It's going to be awesome. I'm just going to think about God all the time. I'm going to teach people about His Word. It's going to be amazing. Well, he got to the monastery, and you know what happened? He was put in charge of the kitchen. Dude, talk about a drag. This guy was not happy. Let me read to you a little bit from the book. The former soldier was not thrilled by this assignment, and for the next 4 years, he did his job grudgingly, and he didn't like it, considering it a penance for his prior sins. He thought, initially, God is punishing me because I lived a sinful life before. Now I'm going to be a monk. Now God is taking it out on me. He's making my life miserable. He said this, he was miserable and tormented by the idea that his soul was so wrecked that God should lead him to this. So I've made such a mess of my life. This is where God brought me. Man, I am a real loser. But then he came to this. It says this. As he dwelled on this idea, he slowly realized that he was focusing too much time and energy on himself. He had joined the monastery out of love for God, and he decided that he needed to concentrate on that simple idea, loving God in whatever he did. And it says this, that this decision changed his life. His conscious desire to approach even the most menial tasks out of love for God and as a part of his service to God altered his attitude, filling him with an unexpected joy. So this guy, he looks at his work, he comes to this point where he looks at his work, scrubbing the kitchen down, he's making, like pots of mush for people to eat, he's like Nacho Libre, and he's going to the market and getting chips, and doing the crumble and the thing. And he comes to a point where this is horrible work and I don't enjoy it, and yet I'm here because I love God. And I'm going to do this work that these monks who are higher up than me have made me do. I'm going to do it as if I'm doing it to God, and it changed everything. And all of a sudden he was excited about stirring the stew, about sweeping the floor, about scrubbing the countertops, and everything was an act of worship to God. You know what happened? It said that there was such a dramatic change in this guy's attitude and his life and all this. And he was still stuck in the kitchen. He was still in charge of the kitchen. But news spread all around, throughout the monastery, outside the walls of the monastery, and it wasn't long before religious leaders from all around were coming to talk and meet with this guy in charge of the kitchen for spiritual advice. Something was different about that guy. He was given one of the worst jobs ever, he thought, and yet God used him in an incredibly powerful way. Paul wrote this in 1 Corinthians 10:31. So whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, do all for the glory of God. Everything you do should be done directly for God. And He's the one who's ultimately going to reward you for it. Let me just draw your attention to this last little part, 7 and 8 in Ephesians 6. It says, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man. It says, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. In other words, you do it as unto the Lord, and the Lord is the one who's going to reward you. How do you treat those in authority over you? Even if they're cruel, even if they're unreasonable, even if they're unfeeling, how do you treat them? If you placed your trust in Jesus, you treat them well. You obey them. You change the way you act towards them. You obey. You do it with the right attitude, with a sincere heart, with a certain respect and a certain fear for them because God put them there. And you do it with the right perspective. I'm not doing this just for them. I'm doing this for God. Let me pray for you. Lord, we thank you for this passage, and yet in a way we're not totally happy about it. We don't like to obey. The sinful side of us, the rebellious side of us says we just want to do what we want to do, and we don't want people over us telling us anything otherwise. And yet, Lord, that's not your will for us. You don't just remove authorities from our lives because we trust in you. Lord, you give us the ability and the desire to worship you by obeying and honoring them. Lord, I pray that you'd help us to do that. As we go to small groups and as we start talking about this and let it roll around in our brains a little bit more and start thinking about the specifics, the people in our lives who are our authorities and who we are struggling with right now, Lord, give us, first of all, give us peace and help us to trust you and help us to consider that if this is your word, and this is what is supposed to happen in the lives of people who are being transformed by you and made new, then maybe we seriously need to consider altering the way that we treat our authorities. Lord, we love you. We thank you for this time, and I pray that you would draw us closer to yourself as we talk about this in the next few minutes. In Jesus' name, amen.